It was scarcely light when he got up in the morning, for he had to be at work at 7. It was almost dark when he got home. He was paid an incredibly small amount for what he did at the factory, and a handful of sous each month for what he did about the grounds. When I gave him 100 francs for some work he had done for me in the house, he could repair anything from a drain to a watch, he said, "Oh, monsieur, c'est trop." "Mais non, monsieur," said I, "ce n'est pas beaucoup." He took it finally, after an exchange of bows and compliments. The elderly wife of the Frenchman from whom we rented the villa told us in a dark whisper that Olympy was a white Russian, and that there was perhaps a petit mystère about him, but we figured this as her own fanciful bourgeois alarm. Maria did not make a mystery out of her husband. There was the revolution. Most of Olympy's brothers and sisters were killed. One knew how that was. And he escaped. He was, of course, an exile and must not go back. If she knew just who he was in Russia and what he had done, she didn't make it very clear. He was in Russia, and he escaped. She had married him 13 years before. Et puis voilà. It would have been nice to believe that there was the blood of the Tsars in Olympy, but if there was anything to the ancient legend that all the stray members of the imperial house took easily and naturally to driving a taxi, that let Olympy out. He was not a born chauffeur, as I found out the day I came back from our automobile ride on foot and, unhappily for Maria, alone. Olympy Semyontsov rode to and from his work in one of those bastard agglomerations of wheels, motor, and superstructure that one saw only in France. It looked at first glance like the cockpit of a cracked-up plane. Then you saw that there were 2 wheels in front and a single wheel in back. Except for the engine, which Maria said was a Morgan moteur, and the wheels and tires, it was handmade. Olympy's boss at the boat factory had made most of it, but Olympy himself had put on the aile, or fenders, which were made of some kind of wood. The strange canopy that served as a top was Maria's proud handiwork. It seemed to have been made of canvas and kitchen aprons. The thing had a right-hand drive. When the conducteur was in his seat, he was very low to the ground. You had to bend down to talk to him. There was a small space beside the driver in which another person could sit or crouch. The whole affair was not much larger than an overturned cabinet Victrola. It got bouncingly underway with all the racket of a dogfight, and in full swing was capable of perhaps 30 miles an hour. The contraption had cost Olympy 3,000 francs, or about $100. He had driven it for 3 years, and was hand in glove with its mysterious mechanism. The gadgets on the dash and on the floorboard, which he pulled or pushed to make the thing go, seemed to include fire tongs, spoons, and doorknobs. Maria miraculously managed to squeeze into the seat beside the driver in an emergency, but I could understand why she didn't want to drive to the Nice Carnival in the Morgan. It was because she didn't that I suggested Olympy should take her over one day in my Ford sedan. Maria had given us to understand that her mari could drive any car. He could be a chauffeur if he wanted to, a bon chauffeur. All I would have to do, voyez-vous, was to take Olympy for a turn around the Cap, so that he could get the hang of the big car. Thus it was that one day after lunch we set off. Half a mile out of Antibes, on the shore road, I stopped the car and changed places with Olympy, letting the engine run. Leaning forward, he took a tense grip on a steering wheel much larger than he was used to, and too far away from him. I could see that he was nervous. He put his foot on the clutch tentatively and said, "Embrayage?" He had me there. My knowledge of French automotive terms is inadequate and volatile. I was forced to say I didn't know. I couldn't remember the word for clutch in any of the 3 languages, French, Italian, and German, in which it was given in my motorist's guide, which was back at the villa. Somehow, embrayage didn't sound right for clutch. It is, though. I knew it wouldn't do any good for an American writer to explain in French to a Russian boat specialist the purpose that particular pedal served. Furthermore, I didn't really know. I compromised by putting my left foot on the brake. "Frein," I said. "Ah," said Olympy unhappily. This method of indicating what something might be, by demonstrating what it wasn't, had a disturbing effect. I shifted my foot to the accelerator, or rather pointed my toe at it, and suddenly the word for that, even the French for gasoline, left me. I was growing a little nervous myself. "Benzina," I said in Italian, finally. "Ah?" said Olympy. Whereas we had been one remove from reality to begin with, we were now 2, or perhaps 3 removes. A polyglot approach to the fine precision of a gas engine is roundabout and dangerous. We both lost a little confidence in each other. I suppose we should have given up right then, but we didn't. Olympy decided the extra pedal was the embrayage, shifted into low from neutral, and the next thing I knew, we were making a series of short forward bounds like a rabbit leaping out of a wheat field to see where he is. This form of locomotion takes a lot out of man and car. The engine complained in loud rhythmic whines, and then Olympy somehow got his left foot on the starter, and there was a familiar undertone of protest. This set his right foot to palpitating on the accelerator, and the rabbit jumps increased in scope. Abandoning my search for the word for starter, I grabbed his left knee and shouted, "Ça commence!" Just what was commencing, Olympy naturally couldn't figure. Probably some habitual and ominous idiosyncrasy of the machinery. He gave me a quick, pale look. I shut off the ignition, and we discussed the starter situation, breathing a little heavily. He understood what it was, finally, and presently we were lurching ahead again, Olympy holding her in low gear, like a wrestler in a clinch, afraid to risk shifting into second. He tried it at last, and with a jamming jolt and a roar, we went into reverse. The car writhed like a tortured leopard, and the engine quit. I was puzzled and scared, and so was Olympy. Only a foolish pride and masculine fortitude kept us going. I showed him the little jog to the right you have to make to shift into second, and he started the engine, and we were off again, jolting and lurching. He made the shift finally with a noise like lightning striking a foundry, and veered swoopingly to the right. We barely missed a series of staunch granite blocks set in concrete that mark ditches and soft shoulders. We whisked past a pole. The leaves of a vine hanging on a wall slapped at me through the window. My voice left me. I was fascinated and paralyzed by the swift passes disaster was making at my head. At length I was able to grope blindly toward the ignition switch, but got my wrist on the klaxon button. When I jerked my arm away, Olympy began obediently sounding the horn. We were riding on the edge of a ditch. I managed somehow to shut off the ignition, and we rolled to a stop. Olympy, unused to a left-hand drive, had forgotten there was a large portion of the car to his right, with me in it. I told him, "À gauche, toujours à gauche." "Ah," said Olympy, but there was no comprehension in him. I could see he didn't know we had been up against the vines of villa walls. Intent on the dark problem of gear shifting, he had been oblivious of where the car and I had been. There was a glint in his eye now. He was determined to get the thing into high on his next attempt. We had come about half a mile in the lower gears. The road curved downhill as it passed Eden Rock, and it was here that an elderly English couple, unaware of the fact that hell was loose on the highway, were walking. Olympy was in second again, leaning forward like a racing bicycle rider. I shouted at him to look out. He said "we," and we grazed the old man and his wife. I glanced back in horror. They were staring at us, mouths and eyes wide, unable to move or make a sound. Olympy raced on to a new peril, a descending hairpin curve, which he negotiated in some far-fetched manner, with me hanging onto the emergency brake. The road straightened out, I let go the brake, and Olympy slammed into high with the desperate gesture of a man trying to clap his hat over a poised butterfly. We began to whiz. Olympy hadn't counted on a fast pickup. He whirled around a car in front of us with a foot to spare. "Lentement," I shouted, and then "Gauche," as I began to get again the whimper of poles and walls in my ear. "Ça va mieux, maintenant," said Olympy quietly. A wild thought ran through my head that maybe this was the way they used to drive in Russia in the old days. Ahead of us now was one of the most treacherous curves on the cap. The road narrowed and bent like a croquet wicket around a high stone wall that shut off your view of what was coming. What was coming was usually on the wrong side of the road, so it wouldn't do to shout gauche now. We made the turn all right. There was a car coming, but it was well over on its own side. Olympy apparently didn't think so. He whirled the wheel to the right, didn't take up the play fast enough in whirling it back, and there was a tremendous banging crash, like a bronze monument falling. I had a glimpse of Olympy's right hand waving around like the hand of a man hunting for something under a table. I didn't know what his feet were doing. We were still moving heavily with a ripping noise and a loud roar. "Poussez le fer," I shouted, which means push the headlight. "Ah," said Olympy. I shut off the ignition and pulled on the handbrake. But we had already stopped. We got out and looked at the pole we had sideswiped and at the car. The right front fender was crumpled and torn, and the right back one banged up, but nothing else had been hurt. Olympy's face was so stricken when he looked at me that I felt I had to cheer him up. "Il fait beau," I announced, which is to say that the weather is fine. It was all I could think of. I started for a garage that Olympy knew about. At the first street we came to, he said gauche, and I turned left. "Ah no," said Olympy, "gauche," and he pointed the other way. "You mean droit?" I asked. "Just that way?" "Ah," said Olympy, "c'est bien ça." It was as if he had thought of something he hadn't been able to remember for days. That explained a great deal. I left Olympy and the car at the garage. He said he would walk back. One of the garage men drove me into Juan Le Pen, and I walked home from there, and into a look of wild dismay in Maria's eyes. I hadn't thought about that. She had seen us drive away together, and here I was, alone. "Où est votre mari?" I asked her hurriedly. It was something of a failure as a reassuring beginning. I had taken the question out of her own mouth, so I answered it. "He has gone for a walk," I told her. Then I tried to say that her husband was bon, but I pronounced it beau, so that what I actually said was that her husband was handsome. She must have figured that he was not only dead, but laid out. There was a mauvais quart d'heure for both of us before the drooping figure of Olympy finally appeared. He explained sadly to Maria that the mechanism of the Ford is strange and curious compared to the mechanism of the Morgan. I agreed with him. Of course he protested he would pay for the repairs to the car, but Maria and I both put down that suggestion. Maria's idea of my work was that I was paid by the city of New York and enjoyed a tremendous allowance. Olympy got 40 francs a day at the boat factory. That night at dinner, Maria told us that her mari was pacing up and down in their little bedroom at the rear of the house. He was in a state. I didn't want an attack of chagrin to come on him as it had on the cordonnier, and perhaps reach his brain. When Maria was ready to go, we gave her a handful of cigarettes for Olympy and a glass of Benedictine. The next day at dawn, I heard the familiar tintamarre and hurlement and brouhaha of Olympy's wonderful contraption getting under way once more. He was off to the boat factory, and his 40 francs a day, his $1.30. It would have cost him 2 weeks' salary to pay for the fenders, but he would have managed it somehow. When I went down to breakfast, Maria came in from the kitchen with a large volume, well-fingered and full of loose pages, which she handed to me. It was called Le Musée d'Art, and subtitled Galerie des chefs-d'œuvre et précis de l'histoire de l'art au XIXe siècle, en France et à l'étranger, 1,000 gravures, 58 planches hors texte. A present to Monsieur from Olympy Semyontsov with his compliments. The incident of the automobile was thus properly rounded off with an exchange of presents. Cigarettes, Benedictine, and Le Musée d'Art. It seemed to me the way such things should always end, but perhaps Olympy and I were ahead of our day, or behind it. An afternoon in Paris. 12 great avenues, I suppose all Parisian children can recite their names, march in bright and clamorous dignity out of that tremendous circle called the Place de l'Étoile, of which the Arc de Triomphe marks the impressive and precise center. The avenues lead to the 12 corners and the 12,000 wonders of Paris. I am sure there must be many a tourist who, losing his hotel in a swirl of rues, has to hunt up the Place de l'Étoile in order to orient himself. Conversely, it is also as easy a place as any in the world to step off into bewilderment and confusion. Take the Avenue Hoche instead of the Avenue Foch by mistake, and where are you? Well, in a few minutes you are in the Parc Monceau instead of the Bois de Boulogne. And if it was in the Bois de Boulogne that your wife and her mother made you promise to meet them for tea, you are hopelessly lost. I first saw the Place de l'Étoile on a rainy night in November 1918, just a few weeks before 500,000 people jammed the circle and the streets round about and shouted, "Vive Wilson," as the savior of democracy rode grandly by on his steep way down from the pinnacle of fame, or at any rate from the heights of popularity. My accustomed route in those days was in the direction of the Seine by way of the Avenue d'Iéna, which led into a quartier that was then bien américain. First you came to the little Place des États-Unis, where at number 11 Woodrow Wilson was to live during his months in Paris. From the second-floor windows of number 11, one could see the statue of Washington and Lafayette. They are shaking hands, that was presented to the city of Paris by Joseph Pulitzer in 1895. At the other end of the square, under the chestnut trees, there has stood since 1923 the monument to the Americans who died in the Lafayette Escadrille, the Foreign Legion, and the American Field Service. A little farther along the Avenue d'Iéna, you come to the Rue Freycinet, which drops down quickly to the Rue de Chaillot, in which at number 5 the Chancery of the American Embassy was housed in those days. It has since been moved to a magnificent new building in the Place de la Concorde. In front of the Ancienne Chancery, the figure of Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, raises his right hand as if in salute to the equestrian statue of George Washington 100 yards farther on in the Place d'Iéna. Washington holds a sword aloft, and I have heard it said that this sword had to be replaced half a dozen times during the peace conference days, because American doughboys and gobs were forever climbing up on the horse and wrenching the blade loose for a souvenir. The streets of this neighborhood were loud with Americans in the months after the war, for in addition to the Chancellery, the American Navy headquarters were just around the corner. United States Marines used to play catch and knock out flies in the Place d'Iéna to the amazement of the French populace, "C'est bizarre, ça?" and the annoyance, as fruitless as it was vehement, of the police. You could hear "How you gonna keep 'em down on the farm?" and "Mademoiselle from Armentières," and smiles. Soldiers and sailors, secretaries of the embassy, stenographers, and code clerks made the district as American as Pennsylvania Avenue. They all departed long ago, of course. The Chancellery, as I said, has moved, and the doors you went through to reach the Navy headquarters now lead into a quiet bar called the Pamela, which wistfully advertises in its window sidecars and Manhattans and Bronxes, but dispenses, I am sure, mainly Pernod and Vermouth Cassis. Baseballs fly no more. The streets no longer ring with song. Washington's sword is safe. The region has been tranquilly captured again by the French. I spent an afternoon there in 1937 searching for old landmarks, renewing one or two old acquaintances, finding, to be sure, a few changes. A stone tablet erected by the Paris post of the American Legion a few years ago at number 5 Rue de Chaillot, where for a year and a half I labored, or at least fiddled around, as a code clerk, interested me. It reads, "In memory of Myron T. Herrick, 1854-1929, served his country during the World War as American ambassador to the French Republic." The word "during" here has the force of "throughout" and is quite misleading. I am sure, however, that the impression rose out of ignorance rather than malice. Malice, I mean, toward the Honorable William G. Sharp of Elyria, Ohio, who served his country during all but the first 4 months of the World War as American ambassador to the French Republic. And even during those 4 months, from August to December 1914, Mr. Sharp was technically, if not actually, the American ambassador to France. The experienced Mr. Herrick had been kept on, after his time, by request of the French government, as I remember it. Mr. Sharp toyed restlessly with his credentials in a suite in a hotel. When at the end of the 4 months Mr. Herrick turned over the embassy to Mr. Sharp, The former had already become forever famous as the American War Ambassador to France. History moved out of number 5 Rue de Chaillot with Myron Herrick, leaving to William Sharp a little corner of oblivion. During the brief weeks that Herrick anomalously tarried, a Republican ambassador under a Democratic president, the Germans drove so hard upon Paris that the French government retreated to Bordeaux, and many a foreign representative packed up and left too. Mr. Herrick stayed bravely on. So, although no mention was made of it, did Mr. Sharp. It was reported in the French and American press that Herrick, urged to flee to safety, had gloriously said, "Sometimes a dead ambassador can be of greater service to his country than a live one." Mr. Herrick, research has shown, did not say those words at all. They would appear to have been invented by some harried journalist hunting for a striking lead to a story. Nevertheless, they helped enormously to make Mr. Herrick's fame, as legend, confer Lafayette we are here, always does. There can be no doubt that Mr. Herrick was a gallant gentleman, and that he worked arduously and late at the embassy before he surrendered his desk to his successor. But he was never in any greater danger of death than Mr. Sharp. The latter, unfortunately for his fame, was not a brilliant or forceful man. He lacked Herrick's engaging courtliness and winning manner. He did not pronounce, nor did anyone pronounce for him, any gallant sayings during 1915, 1916, 1917, and 1918. He just muddled through, an Ohio businessman who, for some obscure reason, had always wanted to be ambassador to France. In one of his labored and pedestrian dispatches to the State Department, he reported that a German shell had landed one day in a street only 3 blocks from the Chancellery, and had killed a white horse. That dispatch has remained a little joke of the service, but it is interesting to note that no German shell ever landed that close to Myron T. Herrick. William Sharp retired because of ill health in 1919, and died shortly afterward. Nobody much remembers him. There is no memorial to him in Paris that I know of, beyond a few amusing and persistent little anecdotes. He remains le grand inconnu of the American diplomatic service. There is, of course, a memorial to Woodrow Wilson in that very section of Paris I have been talking about. This is the Avenue du Président Wilson, which crosses the Place d'Iéna just a few steps behind the statue of Washington. It was named in his honor when he was in the heyday of his popularity, but I have no doubt that if the French could quietly change the name now without causing hard feelings, they would do so. It would probably become the Avenue Gaston Doumergue tomorrow. It seems to me significant that the house in which Wilson lived, at number 11 Place des États-Unis, bears no marker of any kind. I would not have known how to find it on the day of my ramble, for there are a great many huge stone houses on the place, all looking very much alike, if it had not been for Monsieur Léon Barthélemy. I first knew Monsieur Barthélemy in 1918. He was the head coiffeur, indeed the gérant, of a barber shop in the Avenue Kléber, just up the Rue Boisière from the Place d'Iéna, where I used to go get my hair cut. Once in those days, when I did not find him at his chair and inquired where he was, I was proudly told that he had gone to cut the hair of President Wilson at his house in the Place des États-Unis. Later, the little black-haired coiffeur was all smiles when he announced to me that the President had indeed honored him by selecting him as his special barber in Paris. But I was not to believe this was his first great client. He had had princes and generals and premiers in his day. Son Excellence Monsieur le Président was simply the greatest of his clients. In 1925, back in Paris after 6 years, I looked up Monsieur Barthélemy, and there he was, still doing business at the old stand. Woodrow Wilson, the greatest of his clients, had now become the greatest of his idols. He told me what they used to talk about. They talked in English because the great man's French was not too good, but I have forgotten what it was. And did I know that he, Léon Barthélemy, had cut the hair of Kandinsky also? Kandinsky, I was to understand, was the most nervous client he had ever had, although he had had a great many nervous clients, for he was constantly jumping up whenever a door slammed, or a motor backfired, or a manicurist dropped a pair of scissors. He thought they were sneaking up on him, taking pot shots, throwing bombs. I wrote a little story about Monsieur Barthélemy, and it was printed in the old Sunday World. In my wanderings, I thought of Monsieur Barthélemy. I walked again up the Rue Boissière to the Avenue Kléber with doubt and misgiving, for it had been 12 years since I had seen the little barber last, and almost 20 since I had first entered his shop. I was afraid his place would be gone, and it is sad to find places which you once frequented in Paris no longer there. But not a single thing about the little shop had changed. Even the small barber pole up above the door, with its red and white stripes topped by white stars on a field of blue, was still there. And so was Léon Barthélemy, as dark-haired amazingly as ever, as smiling, and as full of his memories of Woodrow Wilson. But I must know he had had Papa Joffre as a client in his last days, and frequently made a trip to a place near Versailles to visit the widow of the great Maréchal. We talked of all his famous clients for a while. Then I told him I wanted to be sure which house it was that Wilson had lived in. "I will go with you," he said, "and we will see it together." So he took off his smock and put on his hat, and we made the little pilgrimage, and he pointed to the high, wide window on the second floor at number 11, out of which the president used to look when he was having his hair trimmed. "A French family of wealth lives in number 11 now," the coiffeur thought. He walked with me the length of the pretty park that forms the center of the Place des États-Unis to look at the monument to the Americans who died in the service of France during the war, 118 in all, 61 of them in the Lafayette Escadrille. Their names are all carved in granite, with the usual number of mistakes that the French invariably make in dealing with Anglo-American proper names. John is occasionally spelled Johhu, etc. Raoul Lufbery, on the spelling of which you can catch many an American, is right. And so are the names of Norman Prince, and Kiffin Rockwell, and Alan Seeger, and most of the others. I noticed that the name of Warren Hobbs appears twice, and so does that of Eli Dinsmore, or Dinsmore Eli. I am sorry, I don't know which one is correct, for it is carved both ways. A little French boy came up and began marking on the monument with a piece of chalk, and my friend told him to stop in a burst of indignation. "Pardon," said the little boy, and ran away.